All right. Hi, everybody. Welcome to week 2. So thank you for your conversations in week 1. I'm enjoying getting to know each and every one of you and seeing the discussions and how they're developing. Week 2, we are focusing specifically on settler colonialism and particularly how that relates to race making in the United States. So to start off, I'm having you read Spickard's chapter 2, which talks very in depth about settler colonialism as well as enslavement. I also found a short video that I've posted in our session on settler colonialism just to give you a better sense of what I mean when I say settler colonialism. And I'll note, I'm also including some references or readings in the week notes as well. If you're interested in any of these topics, these are fantastic articles to learn more about, and you may want to dig into them depending on what you decide to focus your final paper on. So when I say settler colonialism, I'm not sure how well, I don't think the book does a fantastic job of describing what it is we mean when we talk about settler colonialism. Real briefly, as Eve Tuck, a scholar, an Indigenous scholar, talks about, is there's a big difference between colonization that has happened, particularly in different countries in Africa, and settler colonialism where the settler comes to stay. So while both colonization and settler colonialism are both very violent processes that involve elimination and genocide in many ways, the violence is slightly different or somewhat different when the settler is coming and does not plan on leaving. So there are different colonies, particularly in Africa, that were colonized, but then you didn't have a whole villages of Europeans coming to live there. You had some people managing, some Europeans coming down to Africa and managing the colonies that they'd created, but you didn't have a whole slew of people moving into those particular colonies. But you did, as we saw in our reading, you did have many Europeans who we would come to know as white Europeans coming to America with the intention of settling it and living there. So they weren't going to leave again. They didn't plan to go back for the most part to Europe. They planned to stay. So it created a very different context within the United States and how we understand that experience, particularly for Indigenous people in the United States, whom we often refer to as Native Americans. What our book does talk about is the genocide that happened to Native Americans. Certainly, the author goes into great detail describing how using disease and also using war, white Europeans came in and killed off and pushed out Native Americans. They kept pushing them west further and further. And also trying to get rid of them anytime the Native Americans would land on a piece of land that the European settlers then decided later on was valuable and they wanted to live there. So there was certainly acts of genocide happening in early America, but Eve Tuck and Wolf talk particularly when discussing settler colonialism about the elimination of Native peoples, and throughout the U.S. the US history, our government has used different tactics to eliminate Native Americans from our lands, and these tactics are still going on today. So I give you a little bit of context there, discussing settler colonialism and its roots. But now I want to kind of talk about how these systems established within what our reading in chapter 2 have evolved and are playing out currently. So certainly settler colonialism and enslavement were really the roots of race making in the United States. Very early on, we were not referring to people as white or black, or even if we were, those didn't have the same socio connotations that we have for races now. But through settler colonialization and through enslavement in the US is how those categories were, the inception of those categories began by white people to differentiate and to benefit themselves. One concept from the critical race theory literature that I think is helpful in contextualizing this is this idea that Cheryl Harris developed. She's a critical legal scholar, critical race theorist. She identified this concept of whiteness as property. And the way she describes it, and I'm including the reference in your readings, it's not required, but if you're interested in this concept, I encourage you to read the full article. It's brilliant. But this idea of whiteness as property that Cheryl Harris coined began when early on in our nation's history, white European settlers were actually owning people. For the large part, it was enslaved Africans who were forced over by slave traders. But also, as our text talks about, it included enslavement of Native Americans as well. So in that early history, people of color, and in this case, Black people or enslaved Africans and Native Americans, were themselves property. So they couldn't own property themselves. This was also justification that the Europeans used to run Native Americans off of their land, saying that because you haven't settled it, and because you're not Christian, and because you're not all of these civilized things that we talk about, you cannot actually have a claim to the land that you have lived on and that you are native to. So when we think about what is property and what do we understand as property, Cheryl Harris talks about these 3 key principles to property: the right to own it, the right to enjoy it, and the right to pass it on to our descendants. So if I own a home, which I do, I have the right to own it. I have the right to enjoy my home, and I can, if I fully own it, I can pass it on to my kids after I die, if I choose, or pass it on to someone else. And what Cheryl Harris described was how, given our history of whites actually owning people in enslavement, this principle has evolved now to white people treating their very whiteness, their own white skin, as property itself, where they have the right to own it, they have a right to be white, they have a right to enjoy all the benefits they get from their white skin. So you can see specifically how there would be benefits to white skin in the education system during Jim Crow, before Brown v. Board of Education, where we had separate but equal, but we all know that it was not equal during separate but equal. White people had the resources and the benefits in every system we have. So Cheryl Harris says the white people now are treating their whiteness as property in and of itself, in that they're applying all these laws. So back to the principles themselves, as a white person, I have the right to be white. I have the right to enjoy being white and all of the benefits that I get with being white. And I have the right to pass it on to my descendants. And one thing I forgot to say earlier, which is the most crucial, is I have the right to exclude. So if I own property, if I own my home, I can exclude other people from coming into my home or coming onto my property. And Cheryl Harris says it's the same thing with white people and white skin. I have the right to exclude anybody who is not white from the benefits that I amass as a white person in the US. So this is sort of how we have seen these concepts developed during settler colonialism and enslavement evolve into how today white people are privileged and empowered in all of these systems that white people, white elite have developed for themselves, first and foremost. One interesting thing, kind of getting back to the elimination of Native peoples on our land, is the idea that the contrast between the one-drop rule and blood quantum. So our book doesn't go into these things, and they might have touched on them a little bit, but basically the one-drop rule, which I think our book does discuss, the one-drop rule is that if you are a person of color, any children you have will also be people of color. So even if you are a person of color and very fair-skinned and have a child with a white person, that child is still a person of color, and their children are still people of color. So it's one drop of a person of color's blood counts to make a person of color. So you can never achieve whiteness or become white if you are a person of color throughout your entire lineage. And this was very strategic, this one-drop rule, which was a white conception, in that, as you read in our book, enslavement was used to capitalize on the labor of enslaved Africans and enslaved Native Americans to farm the different lands, to help settle the land that they were using. So as our book discussed, there was great incentive, great capital incentive for having enslaved African women have more children who would then grow up to be more enslaved people. So it was a financially savvy plan to continue this one-drop rule, where any descendant of an enslaved person would themselves be enslaved under that rule. And it prevented, again, going back to this whiteness as property, it prevented any person of color, even if they looked white, from attaining any of the benefits that go along with whiteness and whiteness as property. On the flip side, what we see in the US today in terms of Native Americans is this idea of blood quantum. And this is almost the reverse of the one-drop rule, where if you don't understand blood quantum, the idea is that the further away you get from your Native American roots, the less Native American you are, until you don't get any of those benefits to the land or as part of your tribe. So the idea is, if you are a Native American person and you have a child with someone who's not a Native American person, your child is half Native American and they still can get tribal benefits and be a part of the official tribe. And I believe you can get down to a quarter Native American, but once you're less than a quarter, so the generations that are less than a quarter Native American cannot ascribe to that tribe anymore, and they do not get any tribal benefits. Again, this was a very strategic law conceptualized by white Americans, because they were trying to take the land that they had eventually begrudgingly allowed Native Americans to have as their own sovereign land that we now know as reservations throughout the US. So you can see through these blood quantum rules, if we have less and less Native Americans that have sovereignty over their tribal lands, that is a way of white people continuing to take all of the land that is the United States for themselves. It goes back into the pot and we all can have it after there are no Native Americans left in a tribe to claim it, to claim their sovereignty in that space. And again, there's a capital argument being made there if we are trying to seize land from Native Americans, which settler colonialism describes white Europeans doing and continuing to this day. The blood quantum rule works in white European favor to recapture or to capture in the first place the lands that were never rightfully white lands or European lands. They were rightfully Native American lands. So we see these processes still going on today. There's no formal rules around one-drop rules, but we still see the treatment and the systems within our country benefiting white people, and especially of those who do not have any ancestry of people of color. So to come back to this idea, this allows whiteness as property and settler colonialism to really build an empire within the United States where, if we go back to the hierarchy that we were discussing with race last week, the white elite men are at the top of this hierarchy, and they're using these different systems and processes and concepts to continue building capital for themselves. The other concept I wanted to discuss this week was this idea of savagery, because again, I think this idea has evolved and we still see it playing out today. And I'll give you a couple of examples. So in our book, I'm just going to quote a piece of it that I found interesting. It says on page 71, so where English people saw Indians as savage human beings, they saw Africans as beasts. So we're all familiar with this idea of the noble savage, which is, even though our book says it, that Native Americans were cast as savage human beings, I argue that the idea of savage is a dehumanizing one. So it is taking away from this idea of someone's humanity. If you are a savage, think about what comes to mind when you hear that word. You think of animal-like, you think of violent, probably, primitive, all of these things that kind of go against what we believe humans and humanity are kind of wrapped into this idea of savage. And certainly, if we, as our book describes, looking at Africans as beasts, this same thing is going on, perhaps more extreme, in this idea of if you are animal-like, you are not human-like. So we see this language used in terms of dehumanization. I don't know if any of you subscribe to Netflix. I imagine that some of you do, but right now I would highly recommend, if you haven't already, to go watch When They See Us. It's a Netflix 4-part movie produced and directed by Ava DuVernay that shows the experience of the Central Park Five. Real briefly, if you're not familiar with the Central Park Five, these were the 5 Black boys who were accused and convicted and sentenced to many years in juvenile facilities or prisons for the rape of a white woman in Central Park, the Central Park jogger case. This happened in the 80s. And they were recently, all charges were dropped. So basically these 5 Black and Latinx boys had been coerced by the police into confessing. And the movie shows this in great depth. And then they were convicted based on these coerced confessions that they had given to the NYPD. But the reason I bring this case up is because all of the rhetoric happening in the media around these 5 boys was particularly interesting when we start talking about savagery or beast or that sort of thing, because the Central Park 5 started being referred to as this wolf pack, and particularly boys of color started being referred to as wild animals, as a wolf pack roaming Central Park. And it came with all sorts of things. For instance, Donald Trump had taken out a page in the New York Times calling for these 5 boys to be killed. I think it was Pat Buchanan called for one of the boys to be lynched in New York City in the 80s. And so it was this language of savage, of wolf pack, of wilding, was used to dehumanize these boys, and to turn them to criminalize them also, and to justify putting them away. And we can talk about how that works for white benefits at another time. But so we have this sort of context of how these words have been used against people of color, even in the 80s. And now, to jump a little further ahead, I have done some research and work looking at how these concepts are used in film today, particularly in children's films. So I don't know if any of you have seen the Disney movie Pocahontas. That's kind of a fascinating, if you haven't watched it and you have some extra time to watch movies, I would suggest watching Disney's Pocahontas to see the myths that are shown in that movie, particularly after reading chapter 2 and reading a little bit about Pocahontas in our text. And how the whole, genocide of Native Americans was romanticized with, it's a love story in the movie between Pocahontas and John Smith. But there's a song called Savages that the European settlers sing about the Native Americans. And it's very clear on referring to Native Americans as savages and how they're barely even human and they're evil and all of this language. You can look up the lyrics to that song online, and I think you could probably even listen to it if you wanted to. But then fast forward a bit more, and Disney put out another movie in probably, 4 years ago, Zootopia. And the whole concept behind that movie was the whole world was lived on by prey and predators. And the predators began turning savage, which was going back to their own animal-like nature, and the prey were trying to fight them. Anyway, if you look at that movie within the context of considering that the prey are the majority, at one point the bunny says that 90% of the world are prey and only 10% are predators. And when you have that sort of breakdown and compare it to the races that we see in the United States, not given the fact that we have more and more people of color and that percentage is rising. But when you look at those differentiations as prey as white and predators as people of color, you then see this very problematic racialized concept of this movie where it's really telling us these stories about savagery, and how it is animal-like and how it is bad, and all these things that we connote with the word savagery, and applying it in a very racialized way and for kids. I have more information, and I can share. Perhaps I'll share the section of my paper that I published looking at Zootopia in a racialized sense for this week as well. But so my point largely is, if we look at media today, we can often find the same sort of language being used to dehumanize people of color. And that's how racism within the media, the mass media, Hollywood, all of these things are working together that work to dehumanize people of color, and again, elevate white people and to maintain their privilege within all of these systems and their power. So I think that kind of gives you a connection between our readings this week and the history that we're focusing on, and how it connects to race making, and then what we see happening today, that is very much history repeating itself, but also evolving into a different form. The thing that is important to do in terms of race and racism, that I encourage you all to join me in this endeavor, is to watch how it evolves. It's always changing in ways that something doesn't look racist, or there's a way of kind of making it look like it's okay, but that racism usually has evolved in such a way to maintain the white benefits that were gotten from it, even as early as settler colonialism, the inception of settler colonialism and enslavement in the US. So with all that said, our discussion prompts this week, I want you to talk about, how did early American immigration and settler colonialism contribute to race creation? So have some conversation about those connections that you're making. I want you to reflect on how the term savage has been used in the US historically and today. So also draw on other examples where you see this term savagery, or you could use the term beast and kind of figure out how it's used today, very racially. And then lastly, in your readings and videos this week and in this lecture, what has really jumped out to you? Did something connect with you that you were like, wow, I never thought about it that way? Or something you read and you're like, yes, this is exactly what I see happening, and here's the story to go along. So share your examples, share your stories, tell us what really jumped out at you, engage in those conversations with each other. I'll be jumping in where it's helpful and appropriate. Please use the Naomi questions discussion box if you have specific questions for me. More just because the whole class can see those questions. If you ask questions in your specific discussion group, then not everybody's going to see them. So if you have a question for me, please put it in the Naomi's question discussion, and I will certainly follow up there and answer any questions you have. And I think that is it. Have a great week, and I look forward to seeing you online.